Sometimes all we need to stay is a single word spoken in the moment, right? Not a word explained, not analyzed, but felt. A word that doesn't push, doesn't demand, doesn't convince. It just plays, and something in us decides to stay. Maybe you've already experienced this without realizing it. An instant when the noise of the world subsides, breathing adjusts itself, and for a few seconds, the thought stops racing, as if it were hearing something older than him. There are words that are not used to inform. They don't want to teach anything new. They exist to activate a silent memory that the body recognizes before the mind. When these words are spoken, we feel no urgency. We feel presence. That's why sometimes you start to hear something without meaning to. And when you realize it, half the time has passed. Not because he was entertained, but because he was welcomed. Deep down, the human brain doesn't just pay attention to what's interesting. He stays where he feels safe, where you don't need to defend yourself, where you are not pressured to conclude, decide, or react. A few words create exactly this space. They don't activate alert. They activate shelter. They do not stimulate expectation. They invite rest. And when that happens, something curious appears. The natural desire to go all the way. Not to see what happens, but to continue being. This video is not about techniques, not even about mind tricks. It's about ancient, simple, almost invisible sounds that go through the ear and go straight down to a place where haste cannot reach. Perhaps as you listen, something within effortlessly aligns. Maybe you don't understand exactly why, and that is part of the effect. If you feel like there is a calmer rhythm trying to emerge beneath the excess of thoughts, if something in you recognizes this silent call, so remain. There is nothing you need to do now. Just listen. A few words know exactly how to get you the rest of the way. There is a language that does not pass through thought. It does not ask for translation. It does not demand understanding. It happens before the idea, like the shiver that appears before the emotion takes on a name. You don't learn it. You remember her. In nature, nothing explains itself. The tree does not justify its own growth. The river does not announce where it is going. The wind doesn't warn you when it arrives. And yet, everything is understood. Human beings, however, have moved away from this type of listening. We learn to listen only to what comes with intention, argument, direction. But the body remains sensitive to what does not force its way through. He recognizes when something arrives silently. There are words that work like this. They don't want to be interpreted. They create an internal state. When you listen to them, something changes in the posture of your nervous system. The shoulders sag a little. The jaw relaxes without realizing it. The internal gaze slows down, not because someone asked, but because there was no threat. The human mind remains alert when it feels that it will be demanded. She prepares to respond, agree, disagree, choose. But when she realizes there is no charge, she sits down. And when the mind sits, attention lengthens. This is the basis of deep listening. Not curiosity, but the absence of defense. Words that carry this quality do not push time. They suspend the feeling of urgency. Therefore, whoever listens to them does not feel like leaving. There is nowhere to go when the moment stops pressing. It's like entering a clearing. You don't come running. You just notice that the path has become more open. These words don't ask for focus. They remove the excess. And when the excess dissolves, something essential appears. Continuous presence. Have you ever noticed how certain voices calm you down, even before you understand what they are saying? It's not the content. It's the space they create around the sentences. Likewise, certain words are not important by direct meaning, but by the field they establish. They organize the silence between one breath and the next. It is in this interval that attention decides to remain. Maybe that's why, in ancient times, saying little was seen as wisdom. Not because there was a lack of ideas, but because the invisible impact of sound was respected. Today, we are surrounded by words that compete, that demand a reaction, that pull the listener out of themselves. But there are still words that do the opposite. They lead inward, without closing. They invite, without promising. If something in you feels like this kind of language is familiar, if the body recognizes this rhythm without effort, it's a sign that you're not learning something new. It's just returning to a place that has always been there. There is an ancient understanding that sound is not just a vehicle of meaning, but an event in itself. Before any idea is formed, the sound has already touched the body. It vibrated in the air, passed through the skin, reached regions that do not operate by logic. Kodadama is born from this simple and profound perception. Certain words carry a living force that does not depend on explanation. They do not convince, they do not instruct, they do not demonstrate, they establish presence. When pronounced, something is organized internally, as if the body recognized a familiar frequency. It is neither suggestion nor hypnosis. It's alignment. The human brain responds strongly to safe, predictable rhythmic patterns. Sound stable, rhythmic, and smooth sounds signal that there is no danger. When this happens, the surveillance systems decrease activity. Attention stops being fragmented and becomes continuous. That's why some words make a person stay listening without effort, not because they promise something at the end, but because the listening process itself is already rewarding. Kodadama does not act by creating expectations, but by dissolving tension. O listener does not move forward to get somewhere. He follows because he was not pushed out of the moment. In a world saturated with stimuli competing for attention, words that don't compete become rare and valuable. They do not compete for space with the thought, they just slow it down. Sound, in this context, functions as a field stable where the mind can rest without losing consciousness. It is in this rest that the sense of time changes. Minutes stop counting. The experience ceases to be linear. The listener does not perceive progress, he perceives continuity. Kodadama creates this effect because it is not focused on informative content, but on the quality of the encounter between sound and listen. Each syllable is like a stone placed carefully in a silent garden, not to decorate but to support the space. When the mind feels that it will not be required, it remains open, and when it remains open, it does not feel the need to interruption. The brain quickly learns to abandon experiences that require effort excessive without emotional return. But when you find a sound environment that offers security and coherence, he anchors himself. That's why certain words seem to cut through defenses without resistance. They don't activate analysis, they activate recognition. The listener does not think that makes sense, he feels that's right. This is the point where listening stops being an activity and becomes a state. Kodadama operates exactly there, not in conviction, but in stabilization, not in the argument, but in the rhythm. When the sound supports the body, the mind does not need to flee. And when the mind doesn't run away, the end ceases to be an urgency. The listener remains not out of curiosity, but out of internal coherence. Something in it he found a rhythm that does not want to be interrupted. When the mind is agitated, it's not because you think too much, but because you've lost a resting point. The thought, for in itself, is not the problem. It becomes heavy when it finds no place to land. It's in this context that certain words act as calm surfaces. They don't interrupt the flow mentally by force. They offer a place where thinking can slow down by choice own. In the Shintō universe, some words carry exactly this function. No as mantras in the mechanical sense, but as sound states that organize the interior without conscious effort. Words like yasu, shizuka, nagomi, and hikari don't demand intense attention. They ask softness. When spoken or heard, they do not stimulate rapid images or complex associations. They point to basic sensations: calm, silence, harmony, light. The human brain responds well to simple, broad references. When the stimulus does not require precision, the mind relaxes. These words do not tighten the focus, they widen it. And by broadening the focus, they reduce the feeling of urgency that keeps the thought in mind. Constant movement. The effect does not happen because the person understands the literal meaning, but because the sound and the implicit intention reduce the level of internal arousal. The body realizes that there is nothing to resolve it at that moment. Breathing becomes less fragmented. The heart rate finds a more regular pattern. Attention, previously scattered, begins to gather, not for discipline, but for comfort. When the nervous system finds comfort, it stays. This is why, when hearing this type of language, a person does not feel like jumping forward or look for something more stimulating. The stimulus is now complete. These words do not function as commands. They function as environments. Say Shizuka is not asking for silence. It is pointing to a space where silence already exists. The mind enters this space because it recognizes the absence of conflict. Modern thought is accustomed to words that carry tension, comparison, judgment, or promise. Even when they are positive, many words demand a future response. These no longer demand nothing. They do not promise transformation. They do not announce results. They just stabilize the present. When thought calms down in this way, something important happens. Attention stops of being a scarce resource. It becomes natural. One does not need to make an effort to keep listening. Effort is replaced by continuity. The brain, which normally alternate between stimulus S in search of reward, he finds there a constant reward and silent. There are no peaks, but there are no dips either. This balance keeps listening active for long periods. In everyday life, this effect is rare because almost everything competes. Sounds compete, ideas compete, voices compete. The organism learns to defend itself from this dispute, fragmenting attention. But when words that don't compete appear, the system downloads the guard. It is at this moment that the person realizes that they have been listening for a long time without noticed time passing. There was no seduction. There was permission. These words do not want to force the mind outwards or inwards. They simply remove the excess that prevents rest. And when the excess dissolves, thought finds its own natural rhythm. A slower pace, more spaced out, more habitable. In this state, the person is not trying to understand something. She is just following along. And following for the brain is much easier than chase. This is how listening lasts without fatigue. Not because she was captured, but because she was welcomed. Anxiety does not arise because something is wrong in the present, but because the body has been trained to anticipate future threats. It is a state of prolonged surveillance where the organism remains prepared to respond, even when there is no real stimulus. In this state, the mind accelerates not to resolve, but to protect itself. The problem is that this continuous protection consumes energy and fragments attention. Common words they rarely help, because many of them reinforce the idea that something needs to be done, corrected, or achieved. Words that disarm anxiety work in the opposite way. They do not offer a solution. They remove the sense of urgency that sustains the state anxious. In Shintō, certain words evoke natural processes that cannot be rushed. Terms like nagare, misogi, megumi, and utsuroi do not point to control, but to flow, purification, grace, and continuous change. When heard, these words do not ask decision. They remind the body that not everything requires immediate intervention. This remembering has a direct effect on the nervous system. When the organism realizes that it does not need to act, the excitement decreases. Anxiety depends on the feeling that something is about to happen, and you need to be ready. These words dissolve exactly this expectation. The effect is not intellectual. Even those who don't know the precise meaning feel the change of rhythm. The sound of these words carries a cadence that doesn't press. They move like flowing water, without sudden angles. The human brain responds negatively to abrupt and unpredictable stimuli when you are already in a state of alert. On the other hand, smooth, continuous patterns signal safety. When hearing this type of language, the body you receive the message that you can release the accumulated tension. There is no hidden alarm. There is no future requirement embedded in the sentence. When anxiety begins to subside, something important happens to attention. She leaves to jump between possibilities. The mind no longer needs to constantly check what comes later. This creates a feeling of temporal stability. The listener does not feel they need speed up to keep up. On the contrary, he feels he can slow down without losing nothing. This sensation is rare, which is why it is so effective in maintaining listening. The anxiety pushes forward. Her absence allows us to remain. These words also work to dissolve the internal narrative of scarcity. The anxiety, it usually carries the idea that something is missing or about to be missing. Words that evoke flow and impermanence weaken this narrative. They remember that everything moves, including discomfort. They don't promise that anxiety will disappear, but they remove the rigidity with which it is lived. When the discomfort is no longer seen as permanent, he loses strength. The body relaxes because it realizes that it is not trapped. In listening, this translates into continuity. People don't listen. expecting relief at the end. Oh, relief happens during. Every moment of listening is enough. There is no need to reach a conclusion. The brain, which normally abandons experiences when not you see a clear reward, you find a constant reward here, the reduction of tension. This creates a silent bond with the voice and words, not an emotional attachment but physiological confidence. Therefore, anyone who hears this type of language does not feel impatience. There is no anxiety to finish, because the anxiety is no longer being fed. Words don't distract of the internal state. They rearrange it, and when the body reorganizes itself, the mind accompanies. Staying is no longer an effort. It just becomes the natural consequence of a calmer and more habitable state. There's a reason why some people keep listening until the end without realizing it. Time passes. It's not curiosity, nor expectation for a final revelation. It's a bond, but not the common emotional bond, based on identification or you excitement. It's a silent, almost physiological bond, which is formed when the body recognizes enough consistency and predictability to relax. Certain words create exactly that kind of stable presence. They don't stand out. They don't surprise. They don't seek impact. They remain. And by remaining, they allow the listener to also remain. The human brain is highly sensitive to coherence. When you realize that an environment's sound does not change direction abruptly, does not require quick responses, and does not introduce unexpected voltage, it reduces the need for constant monitoring. This creates a sense of implicit trust. The person is not evaluating what they hear all the time. She is simply following along. This continuous monitoring is what transforms listening into presence. Words stop being something that comes from outside and pass to become part of the listener's internal rhythm. In Shintō, this sensation is linked to the idea of being in harmony with the environment, without rigid separation between the observer and the observed. Words that evoke this state do not place the narrator above the listener, nor the listener as someone who needs to learn something. They place both on the same plane of experience. There is no hierarchy. There is no forced driving. There is coexistence. When this happens, the listener does not feel that is being taken somewhere. He feels like he is sharing a space. This type of language creates a relational field different from the one we are in. Accustomed. In most communications, there is a clear intention to influence, convince, or maintain attention by constant stimulation. Here, attention is maintained by absence of pressure. The bond forms because there is no noticeable manipulation. The body realizes that he is not being used as a means to an end. This perception generates security, and security prolongs the stay. As this bond is established, something curious happens to the perception of time. The listener is not counting how much is left. He is not waiting for a conclusion. Each excerpt is sufficient in itself. This does not mean a lack of interest in the whole, but an absence of anxiety about the end. The brain, when not in a state of vigilance, does not need to anticipate. He can just keep going. That's why, in this state, turning off it seems more difficult than continuing to listen. The words that create this effect do not attempt to create artificial intimacy. They don't say, "Trust me." They demonstrate, through their rhythm and constancy, that they will not invade. This implicit respect is perceived even without awareness. The bond is not built by intense emotion, but for stability. And stability is rare in saturated environments of stimulus. In the end, what keeps a person going until the last moment is not the promise of something greater, but the continuity of a state that is already comfortable. The listener remains because he found an internal rhythm that he doesn't want to interrupt. Words don't hold, they sustain. And when something sustains without demanding, the presence maintains itself. Reaching the end does not mean completing something. It just means realizing that the movement slowed down enough to reveal what was always there. Throughout this listening, there was no sequence of ideas to memorize, nor a teaching to be retained. Oh, what happened was a gradual adjustment, a subtle return to a state in which the body does not need to defend yourself, and the mind doesn't need to run. This state is neither special nor rare. It is, usually covered up by excess noise, intention, and haste. When certain words cease, what remains is not absolute silence, but a different quality of attention, an attention that does not seek, does not evaluate, does not anticipate. She just is. This type of presence requires no practice or discipline. She appears when something stops interfering. And perhaps this is the most important point. Nothing was added. Just something was taken away. Excess tension, constant expectation, need to get somewhere. When this goes away, even for a moment, the what's left is enough. It is commonly believed that calmer states depend on ideal external conditions. But experience shows that often all you need to do is change the way you listen. Not the content, but the pace. Not the information, but the space between the words. In this space, something rearranges itself effortlessly, not because he was guided, but because he was allowed. O body knows how to do this when it is not interrupted. The mind follows when it is not pressed. Perhaps when you finish listening, you realize that there is no clear sense of closure, no internal endpoints, and that is intentional. What was created here is not a conclusion, but a continuity, a state that can extend beyond this moment if you allow, not as something to be maintained, but as something to be recognized whenever the internal rhythm asks for shelter. If this listening made sense to you, not as an idea, but as a sensation, consider stay close by. Sign up and continue walking with us through this space where words do not compete, and silence also teaches, not to accumulate content, but to inhabit states that make the path lighter. As you move forward, carry with you not the specific words, but the reminder that there is an older rhythm available beneath the surface of haste, a rhythm that does not require a name, neither form nor explanation. It reveals itself when there is enough space to hear it. What if what we call deep attention is not something we achieve, but something? What approaches when we stop resisting? And if what we call destiny is just the constant whisper of the kami, following every step since before we learned to listen?